All right, everyone, welcome back to another edition of your Adrenal Fix. My name is Dr. Rosen, and I call myself the Adrenal Fatigue Recovery Ninja. And today I have the special honor of having my guest here, Nick Pineault. He is a health journalist who has published more than 1,500 online articles through a daily newspaper called Nick and Jen's Healthy Life. In 2017, he authored the Non-Tinfoil Guide to EMF, which is an unconventional book endorsed by top health authorities like Dr. McCullough, and which combines the common sense and a humor to tackle the various serious topic of electromagnetic pollution and its effects on human health. So welcome today, Nicholas. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for having me.
So I got to ask you, so what made you go into this area? I mean, I'm very aware of EMFs and the impact on the health. So, but tell me a little bit about you and who you are and why you got into this.
Sure. Well, I've been we've talked before hitting the record button here. I've been into trying to put my ideas online since 2010. Really, as a health journalist, as a health conscious guy with a background in communications and copywriting, I used to be just researching mainly about nutrition at the beginning of my background, just as discovering through documentaries. I recall watching Food Matters in, I think it was 2010 or 2012, and it totally shocked me because I hadn't realized that processed foods were so bad for you, and that you had to choose food quality. I just knew quantity, and I was trying to do some bodybuilding, so it was all about eating more and more calories, you know. That was back in 2012, and I didn't feel good about what I was doing. I felt horrible. My digestion was horrible, so I was like, maybe something isn't working quite right. So I started digging even more into health, looking into guys like Dr. Axe, Mercola, and new authorities that were publishing online information. And at one point, I realized maybe I could do the same. I could publish my findings online, build an audience, and maybe make a living out of it. Who knows? I ended up publishing a series of ebooks that was 2013 about our food supply, the truth about fat-burning foods. It became a kind of internet bestseller. I think we sold something like 75,000 copies. That's fairly high for ebooks. And then off of that, me and my business partner and wife, Jen, we built this newsletter that's a daily newsletter called Nick and Jen's Healthy Life. So I've been writing about health since then, publishing almost 2,000 articles every single day, basically, for the last 5 years. And last year, or maybe a year and a half ago, I started reading these books about the dangers of cell phones. And I always looked at my cell phone with a kind of a little bit scared, a little bit prudent, because I thought in the back of my mind, well, I've heard some reports about brain cancer, and some people say it's not an issue. But still, what if there's a chance that maybe this isn't good for us, and everyone's using it so much? And back in just 2013, it wasn't around that much. Now 2017 it's everywhere, like the smartphones, and people especially having enough like a data plan to be scrolling 24/7 on Instagram and downloading HD videos. So it's even the way we use it has completely changed in a couple of years now that the phone plans are not $100 anymore. They're way cheaper than that. So people kind of are always on, right? And the signals, these electromagnetic fields, the signals, the wireless signals that make it so you can download data from the cellular antenna a couple of kilometers away, they are there. They're invisible, but they're still there. So my question as a health journalist was, okay, is that doing something to us? So I read a couple of books. Deborah Davis is a great author on the topic. Martin Blank, who's a PhD, published Overpowered in 2015. And I read these books, and they seemed to me very credible. On the other hand, I could find people that are PhD researchers, doctors, engineers that were writing rebuttal articles saying that, no, it's nonsense. These books are kind of overstating the issue, maybe doing a bit of fear mongering, and it's not scientific and whatnot. And I felt, well, it's probably the truth is somewhere in the middle, probably. And it turns out that the more I dug into it and the more research that comes out every month now, the more it goes in the direction that these EMFs are doing something to us. And not only something, it's doing something serious because we're always bathing in a high EMF environment. And it turns out that these kind of signals, especially this frequency, like in nature, uh, we have natural EMFs. For example, UV radiation, right? It's one type that I like talking about because we don't see it, but we know it can burn your skin if you overdo it. On the other hand, if you have just a little bit, just the right dose, you have this vitamin D. So it can be beneficial, but it can also technically almost burn you or kill you, right? So that's UV radiation for you. And yet it's invisible, but it's there and it's real. The same thing for cell phone radiation. It's not there, but doesn't mean it's not doing something to your biology. The problem with these cell phone signals is that there's nothing in nature that looks like this signal to your biology. It's just another frequency. The frequency is so high that it's brand new. And the levels, for example, of something they call in Europe electrosmog, which is just the electromagnetic pollution in the city, are so high that it's a quadrillion times higher than back in nature. Like these signals are not like a little bit more, they're orders of magnitudes more than what our biology is used to receiving. So my findings are basically to sum it up is that EMFs are a stressor to your health and something to consider, just like diet and movement and sun exposure and let's say mold toxins. It's something that can almost make or break your health if you're overexposed and if you're especially sensitive. So that's my finding to sum it up.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful rabbit hole that you sort of have gone through, and it sort of opens your eyes. It's almost, it leads to the more information you know, almost the more you don't want to know. Is that, did you find that?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I took 650 pages of notes while gathering everything I could get my hands on EMFs. And to be perfectly honest, it was a process just as I felt like the mental pleasure of writing a book is incredible because you're like, okay, I'm making things simpler, but it is also mental torture. I felt overwhelmed. I felt almost like a kind of doomsday repressive, like the walls are closing on me kind of feeling, because I'm like, oh, wait a minute, this is actually very serious. And I felt just the pain of people that don't understand that these devices can do something to them. It was super hard to write a book, and I did feel like there's no hope and whatnot. At one point, though, I focused on solutions, and that's what I put in the book. It's like, okay, fine, maybe EMFs are the next smoking. Who knows? We're going to know that in 30 years. But what do you do now that there's uncertainty in 2017 to end up in 2047 still healthy, which will be difficult with everything else that's going on in our society?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, Nicholas, because I feel the same way. Sometimes we can get overwhelmed by the availability of information and the implications it has on our health. But I really do believe that, you know, my motto has always been little hinges swing big doors, you know, so it doesn't behoove us to put our head in the dirt and ignore the reality of the environment in our body. And that's one of the big things that I talk about with the adrenals, and why I was so excited to talk to you, and we'll get into that. And you mentioned in what you were saying is it's another stressor. In terms of the body has to process it, and it's not used to it, and it's at such more magnitude than you know it's ever had in any point in time. And I also look at it as bad as potentially things can be, you do have to get into solution mode, and you have to get into, okay, well, what do we do about it? So I say sometimes it's the worst of times and it's the best of times, because even though we have much more chemicals and environmental smog and EMFs and toxic exposures, we also have a lot more information too. So we'll talk about that, but why don't we talk a little bit about, what I really like in your book is how you get into the science, but you also keep it a lighthearted way where we don't try to overwhelm people and scare them, but you also point out the facts. So let's maybe talk about what you mentioned in terms of black swan theories, and some of the things that you talk about with how studies can be biased and what the reality is out there.
Yeah, well, the argument when it comes to EMFs is always, well, it's inconclusive, right? And this is the same thing that happened with tobacco for around almost 70 years. In reality, it wasn't clear if tobacco smoke was linked to cancer directly, if there was a reason to say we should put a warning on cigarettes and not necessarily ban them, because let's face it, still see people every single day smoking. But they know the risk, or technically they know the risk, because it's all over the place, it's recognized. And then there's also a second factor where if you're a smoker, you don't smoke inside next to a toddler or next to even another adult nowadays in public places, because you are causing them to have this illness, this smoking related cancer risk. So when it comes to the studies around EMFs, right now there are literally thousands of different studies that show that EMFs, even at very low levels, can have biological effects. Now, what is not clear is to what extent. So can we say it decreases your health by 33% at this level, and then by 20%? We don't have these figures. So it's very hard to say, okay, your illness or your fatigue, for example, is due to EMFs 100%. I cannot say that because it's so multifactorial, the environment you live in. What is safe to say right now is that these signals are increasing, and that symptoms that are seen in a clinical setting with doctors specialized in treating people who seem to be very sensitive to EMFs, they're seeing amazing results removing EMFs from the environment, and people get better. So going back to an environment that is low EMF, that it is simply the way we're meant to be. In the 50s, there were no cell phone signals around. It wasn't even an idea having a cell phone. They would look at that as if it's straight from Star Trek, right? It's incredible. It's an incredible technology, but these signals are just foreign to the human body. When you talked about black swan, it is a very incredible video that I saw from a researcher called Magda Havas from the Trent University in Toronto, in your neck of the woods. And basically, she gave the example of I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically she said that it's not saying that there's no conclusive evidence is basically, yes, it might be true, but it's more like how you act in front of the inconclusive evidence. And if there's even one study that says that maybe EMFs are harmful to the human biology, it is nonsense to increase the signals further before we have dug into this study and say, well, is it a fluke? Was the study design maybe poor, or is that financial interest from, I don't know, someone selling a cell phone case or something crazy like that, financial interest? But it's not one study, Joel, it's thousands of studies. So all these studies individually prove that someone who say these signals do nothing to the human body is wrong, is simply not scientific in its approach. And when I actually dug into it, I found certain links in the published medical literature, scientific literature, that is so strong that it got me in shock, literally. For example, the link between having one of these devices, a smartphone, in your front pocket and the sperm damage that can occur. So there's, in the last 10 years alone, I could find 9 or 10 different meta-analyses. So these large studies that look at a bunch of other studies to know, okay, out of 20 or 90 studies, what is the conclusion? And each one of them that summed up 201 studies in the last 10 years alone said EMF, cell phone signals, and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, these signals will reduce fertility in men. So I'm like, as a health journalist, I'm like, well, this is information that needs to be front page of Toronto Star, and then Montreal Gazette, and then CNN. Like, people need to know, do not put this device in your pocket. It's not a safe place to put it. Put it right in front of you on your desk, and maybe you're okay. But men still put it in their front pocket all day, every day. I see that on the street every time because they're not aware of it. So this is the problem around this skepticism that I see from certain scientists or even medical doctors that are like, well, Nick, this is tinfoil, this is a non-issue. And I'm like, well, what about the 201 studies about sperm count? And they're like, what? They haven't heard about all the published literature. And when they read my book, and I want to sound like I'm self-promoting, either my book or Deborah Davis or Martin Blank or even Bioinitiative Report, there's a lot of great stuff out there that was published that is very credible. They go, oh my God, this is actually such a big issue. Well, it is. It is. And this is why this is like the fact that people can interpret the same science in different ways is why there's such a debate. And also, let's face it, let's talk about the politics for a second. If I'm an industry like the telecom industry and people who manufacture cell phones and people who manufacture circuit boards for cell phones, you do have a strong financial incentive to have studies tell you that cell phones are safe. It's just the bias that is there. And it's a fact that when they look at the evidence, evidence that is very unsurprisingly financed by the telecom industry is biased towards cell phones are safe, and the independent studies are biased towards it, or I don't know if they're biased, but they come up with a conclusion that it's probably not safe or that there is an effect. So again, it's just follow the money trail. It's not like everyone involved in an industry is biased and is evil. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that generally when you pay millions to have a study, you kind of want it to prove that your products are totally fine. And we end up in a society where not only are the products not fine, but the regulations are so ridiculous around even cell phone safety testing that have literally nothing to do with how we use them, that we end up with a product that everyone thinks is completely safe, but I think it's completely not. It's not proven to be safe, like 0%, basically.
No, it's amazing. And, I got to give you a compliment on how you wrote the book, because it is a politically charged topic. And you really sort of tread the line very nicely with some humor, but some reality. So I wanted to compliment you on that. But
thank you.
There's nothing new about that, Nicholas, especially within my area with health research and with pharmaceutical industry, and that's even more of a politically charged area, which I try to stay away from.
Yeah.
And I also, like you, I just want to be an advocate, A, for the truth, and B, for people's health, so that they can, we're not talking about, hey, listen, you're never going to use a cell phone anymore, but why don't we just try to understand the risks and, the solutions, that we're not talking about like living in a bubble and wearing a hazmat suit every day. We're just talking about doing sensible things to reduce your exposure and your risk. So those are the things I want to talk about towards the end. But as it relates to my audience, as we talked about before we started the cameras as well, as I say, it really goes further than adrenal fatigue. Hans Selye was the original pioneer on the alarm phase, and then we have the sort of the resistance phase, and then we have the exhaustion phase. And I think that was a good model in for when the time it came out. But now it really comes down to what I told you something earlier is called cell danger response, which basically means when the cells are overwhelmed with information, and we can call that information stress, whether that stress is from an infection, whether that stress is from a chemical, whether that stress is from not enough food, too much food, not enough oxygen, too much oxygen. It's really a symphony that has to orchestrate all of the behind scenes, basics that we need in terms of blood pressure, heart rate, fluid balance, blood sugar levels, reducing inflammation, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes. But when that stress gets to the point where it's overwhelming the cell and it can't keep an equal relationship between supply and demand, something has to give. And what ultimately gives is the body prioritizes and it starts to shut down less important mechanisms or less important systems. So we see sometimes thyroid health goes down, hormonal balance goes down, reproductive balance goes down, because that's not the priority at the moment. So I'd really like to talk about some of these things that you found specifically as it relates to the mitochondria. But, we're really scared in terms of Well, we'll ask that question next, but tell me, some of the things that you found with your research on, the physiological impact of the constant bombardment of EMFs and how that impacts the person, not just at the adrenal level, but sort of the cellular level. So why don't you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the number one researcher you people can look into is called Martin Pall, Pall, and Martin Pall, he's a retired. I think it's just a term that says he's working more than ever now, and now he's independent from his university. But anyway, the guy has looked into the mechanism because it's been something the skeptics have used over and over, and even the industry saying, well, there's no plausible mechanism that could explain how this low-level signal that, let's face it, is so low in the spectrum compared to X-rays, compared to nuclear radiation that we know are problems. We know they break DNA, these signals, these EMFs are dangerous, and this is why we only use them in certain situations in medical settings, right? X-rays are a big deal. You need to have a good reason to have an X-ray, or else the benefit doesn't outweigh the risks. And well, the mechanism is kind of simple, and is something called the voltage gated calcium channel, VGCCs. And basically, if you picture a cell, you have a bunch of different channels going where the calcium transport goes in and out. And basically, you have little doors. These are voltage gated calcium channel, and just as the name entices, you have little sensors in there that respond to voltage, very, very low level electricity. So low, in fact, that Martin Pall thinks that the safety levels of EMFs, our regulations right now, are probably 7 million times too low. But that's another rabbit hole we can get into later. But basically, the idea is that when cells are exposed to external signals, such as a cell phone signal, for example, these little doors stay stuck open, and then calcium, intracellular calcium, just increases and increases and increases. And this creates a series of downstream effect in the cell. So it's an indirect effect and not a direct effect, like in the case of X-rays and nuclear radiation that are ionizing, that will literally break bonds, molecular bonds in the cell. Boom, boom, everything explodes. It's not like that. It's not a direct impact. It's a very indirect impact, but just a couple of minutes of exposure to a cell phone, and then the BGCCs can stay open for a couple hours. So you get a massive influx of calcium in the cell, and then it will create a downstream effect where you have too much peroxynitride that will form, and this is one of the most dangerous oxidants to the mitochondria, one of the most powerful mitochondrial poison that there is. So this downstream effect is basically what explains that the cell is so affected, and depending on where you hold your phone, cells right next to it will be more affected than, let's say, if I have my phone next to my head, my big toe will not be that affected because I have so much distance. But if you put it, this explains also why, for example, people who put their phone in their shirt pocket all day have reported that sometimes they go see their docs, their cardiac specialists, and it turns out that they have arrhythmia or other heart-related problems because of their cell phone, because when they remove the source, all of a sudden their problems vanish. Go figure, because the heart contains a very high concentration of these cells with a lot of VGCCs. So the effect is even stronger in certain parts of the body that are high in VGCCs. So this research is not only credible, not only proven, but then Martin Pall has looked at, he's only gathered research from other researchers. He didn't do the rat studies themselves, but he found several studies on rats that show that when you give rats calcium channel blocking drugs, you end up nullifying the effect almost completely. So this proves the mechanism. This proves that EMFs, one of the main mechanisms that prove that, let's say, just a Wi-Fi in a room or even a cell phone can have a biological effect, is through this excess calcium in the cell. And now the question is, people were like, okay, I'm going to start taking a calcium channel blocker. Well, that's not really a solution, because once you block the calcium channels altogether, you have all sorts of other side effects that can occur, right? So it's not necessarily a good idea to do that, but it has a lot of disrupting effect, especially on the NRF2 pathway that is very hot right now in people that are into biohacking, because they try to optimize this pathway through intermittent fasting and cold thermogenesis, and it can increase your longevity. And to be honest, some of the downstream effects and the pathways are above my head, because I'm not a scientific level researcher, but I know that this pathway is disrupted a lot. So it's kind of ironic that a lot of people that are looking to optimize their biology so much, they wear a Bluetooth tracker all the time. So on one hand, they're optimizing their pathway, the other hand, they're disrupting it. So
Right.
it's hard to tell to what extent, but I mean, it just shows you that it's one of the most important pathway for longevity from what I'm getting, and this is affected on a serious level. And if I can add one thing that might be even more concerning, actually, and I still have a hard time believing it myself. There's German research that looked at the difference in DNA single and double strand breaks from X-rays compared to cell phones. So what they did is a Comet assay. So basically, this is when you take a DNA sample, and you have a golden standard in scientific research where you will apply something, either a poison, a toxin, mold toxins, or a signal. In that case, it was X-rays in sample A, and then cell phones in sample B. And they applied a signal, 24 hours of cell phones, and then 1,600 chest X-rays, and they look at how much is the DNA destroyed. And it turns out that they compared the two and said this is similar damage. So if this is true, like now, I always say if this is true, because this hasn't been reproduced from what I know by 10 or 15 different other labs. But if this is true, it means that maybe the low-level radiation that we're exposing ourselves to through our cell phones might be worse for our DNA, and even DNA breaks and cellular stress, than X-rays. And if this is true, we've made a very big mistake here.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of rabbit holes, and sort of the things that sort of perk up on me is, I always say that the people that we help, or the people that are on our page, ultimately do have that perfect storm, Nicholas, where they have that genetic susceptibility with those, not just the EMFs alone, but with they've been exposed to mercury in their teeth after having, dental amalgams when they were 8. They, had mono when they were 16. They've worked 3 jobs. They've had post-traumatic. So they just have the craziest things going on. But, sort of where my ears perked up is, and which you wrote about too, and you mentioned, is not just peroxynitrate, but also those calcium channels constantly being open. Ultimately, you have upregulation of the mitochondria that further requires energy production to deal with that, the consequence of that. And as a consequence too, it really depletes our balance. And in life, everything's about balance. So if your cells are set up to not necessarily repair the DNA as quickly, there's a lot of genetic SNPs, and you can kind of see sort of my mad scientist background here in the back. I look at particular SNPs that tell us, hey, your body, for every dollar you put in the coin machine, only 3/4 come out when you're repairing your DNA, when you're making new cells, when you're making new tissues like hair, skin, teeth, nail, bones. So if you put, if you're, at a birthday party and you need to put a lot of dollar bills in the quarters, then you're going to expose the body for its weakness. And that certainly happens for people that not only can't repair their DNA in terms of their hair, their skin, their teeth, their nails, their bones, but also repairing the cell membrane, which is very, very very important. And also making that balance like we were talking about where, okay, peroxynitrate or a lot of these free radicals, it's a lot of fires going on and there's not a lot of firemen. And when we deplete our body of glutathione and SOD, then all of a sudden you have this rage against the machine where not only is this free radicals, bombarding these toxic things that are going on in our body, but they impact the cell too. And then they impact, in terms of what you've written about, blood-brain barrier. And so that's, I guess, what I wanted to talk about, especially as it relates to kids, because, it gets a little overwhelming if I'm listening to this. So, you mentioned mainly 3 areas in your last chapter in terms of just the phone itself, the home, and for our children. So if we can mention a little bit about that, that would be great. Because I always like to give my listeners, okay, well, what do I do about it? Like, what do I got to do? So, I mean, obviously I want them to buy the book, but I also want them to get some good, useful things that, what are the small hinges that they can do that will swing the big doors?
Oh, sure thing. So the first thing is to listen to everything I've just said. No, seriously. But take a big breath, because once you hear that, it can sound like, oh my God, X-rays and what. Just the fear response from learning this information can be huge. So just a year ago or so, I didn't think it was serious. I had my phone in my pocket. But I'm still alive today. You are still alive. So don't freak out too much. To the extent that it causes insomnia, right? So that's my first advice. And then focus on what you can do. So if it's EMF, let's say from your neighbor on the subway train, well, it's not like we live in a society where you can say, hey man, please don't secondhand Wi-Fi me or cell phone me, right? It doesn't work like that, at least not yet. Right. But you can control your own phone. So what I say is, as a general rule, try to keep personal devices at least 1 foot from your body. So it means same thing with children. Let's say if you have your 4-year-old or even teenager be on the phone like that, these things were not intended for children. And even for adults, it will increase your risk of brain cancer if you listen to independent research. And that's like for ipsilateral, so same side where you speak to brain cancer, so and parotid gland, and anyway, another rabbit hole. But basically, holding it like this at 1 foot distance, you will reduce the amount of EMFs your body and your face and your brain is exposed to by at least 80%. So how do you do this? Well, you can use speakerphone, but if you don't want to be annoying to your neighbors, you can use these. And I'm showing my Apple earbuds. So these it's just a wired headset with an integrated microphone, and you can use that and then hold the phone in your hand or have it in front of you on a desk, which can help you create even more distance. Just think about distance from your body. So instead of texting right next to your abdomen, well, these signals can actually have been shown, and there's starting to be emerging science about the effects on gut microbiome. These things are very tiny, and we know that this is our second brain, and that every bacteria in your body has a role and might be even more critical than some of our own cells, right? So do not text and hold your phone right next to your abdomen. Hold it a little bit further away, and just that will make a huge difference on what kind of amounts of EMFs you're exposing your body to. And when it comes to the home, and if you have children, this is especially important because I'm going to be actually a new dad in a couple of months now, and I can only imagine what it's like to be a parent having kids that don't sleep. But I can imagine it might be one of the causes of adrenal fatigue. It's like you can never sleep, right? So kids and adults alike will sleep better in a low EMF environment, because EMFs, even if it's just Wi-Fi in a room or even in your home, will directly reduce the quality of your sleep and reduce your melatonin production at night. That's one of your most important sleep hormones. So what do you do about it? Well, you can choose to go hardwired and have an Ethernet cable for your computers and have wires all over your house. This is my number one solution, but it's a little bit more expensive and a little bit more serious. But if you're not there yet, you can always at least turn off the Wi-Fi signal at night. So you can either just unplug your Wi-Fi router, or an even better or easier solution for people to just set it and forget it is to have these little Christmas light timer that you can grab off of Amazon for around $10. and you plug your Wi-Fi router machine inside this timer, this outlet timer, and then you can set the timer so it will close the outlet and your Wi-Fi at the same time around 11 p.m. when you go to bed, and then it will open itself automatically without you even taking action about it at 6 a.m., for example, when you wake up. So at least you will have like these 6 to 8 hours of a low EMF environment, and your sleep quality will go up. And I have a lot of friends and researchers and biohackers in my circles that track their sleep with using the Oura Ring, which is a cool ring where it can tell you your sleep quality, and then different apps. And they report that every single time that they sleep, that they turn off the Wi-Fi at night, they see a 20% bump at least in their deep sleep, or sometimes better than that, depending on how sensitive you personally are. And I feel it the second that the Wi-Fi is on in a house. I feel it because I just don't sleep better. I don't feel recovered. And when I turn it off, or when I go camping or something where it's just a little shack in the middle of the woods, I feel amazing. And then I have these dreams, and this is a sign of deep sleep. So if you only do these two things, even for your children, so create distance, make sure that they talk on a headset instead of right next to the ear, it's going to make a huge difference in the amount of EMFs that you're exposed to. And I think you'll feel the difference, especially when you wake up in the morning and you have slept all night long with a low EMF environment. You're like, oh, wait a minute, this is the way things should be. I don't feel as as much as I need caffeine in the morning, or that I literally am more fatigued than the evening prior, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those are great little tips, and that I have that Oura Ring. We use it for I had another interview with another person, and we look at more as data tracking versus biohacking, and
yes,
because everyone's going to have different bell curves and sweet spots, so to speak, and too much of something for someone else might be just perfect for someone else. But just to speak about the Wi-Fi, we live in Florida now, and so we get hurricanes. And so a couple years ago was Hurricane Wilma, and we were out of power for probably a week and a half. And it was actually okay though, because there was no Wi-Fi, and you could almost feel like you were camping. You didn't feel that constant permanent hum, that sort of static electricity that's there. Then what we did is, when we moved the wireless router, it was in our room, we moved it out of the room. It was so much deeper in terms of the sleep.
Oh,
so
yes.
Definitely that for sure. I definitely don't wear this now most of the day. I like to, because of the Bluetooth, but when I'm exercising and I'm sleeping, I want to track my sleep. The other thing I didn't know about, which you pointed out with a lot of other good things, is no case, right? Not having the case, because the case on the phone can increase the exposures with the EMFs. Did you put that in there as well, right?
Yeah, well, that can be a thing. It can definitely increase the EMFs, because your phone has to work harder to connect to the tower. And the way technology is built is that if you're at 5 out of 5 bars of power, the signals are way lower than at 1 out of 5. Sometimes they can ramp up 1,000 times the EMFs that are emitted if you're in a tunnel, in a building, and in a very low connectivity place, because your cell phone kind of has to ramp up the signal in order to connect just as well. So it's one thing to maybe remove the case, or there's a company that I love called Defender Shield that does special EMF blocking cases that actually have openings on the sides, so it lets the signal come in and out, but it does block quite a lot of signal that would go towards your body. So in my opinion, I still wouldn't use a cell phone next to the head even if you have this case, but at least if you carry it around. And some people tell me, Nick, you know what, you always tell about hitting airplane mode all day long, and I know I'm like, people do not reach me on my cell phone because they know the deal. Like, I'm this author about EMS, right? I'm not gonna have my cell phone around all the time, and they ping me on Facebook or something, and that's fine. But I know a lot of parents or people whose job require them to be on a cell phone almost 24/7. So what do I do? Well, in that case, having a special case if it's near your body. And then if you have to keep it in your room at night because maybe you have your teenager that's over at a sleepover with a friend and you want them to call you in case of emergency or something like that, totally understand. Put your phone as far away from your pillow as possible. I see a lot of people putting it right next to their head, or even worse, below, like right under their pillow. So you're essentially, it's the most horrible place to have it, and it will reduce your sleep so much that a lot of people report feeling anxious even when they have a cell phone next to their head for hours. It's not a natural thing. And something that not a lot of people understand or know is that a cell phone, if it's not on airplane mode with all the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi removed, it's constantly emitting. Even if you don't do anything with it, there's no notification, there's nothing happening on the phone, or so you think, but in reality, it's pinging the tower every couple seconds just to make sure that in case of a call, it will be able to connect. So it is emitting EMFs a little bit 24/7. So this is why it can be disruptive. So in that case, just close my top there. Put your phone as far away as possible from your pillow. It can be even in a room, and then you put the ringer on very loud maybe, or you can get a landline. Like these things still exist, even if people try to get rid of them.
Right.
It can be a good alternative in the bedroom. A landline is just this phone that's ubiquitous. It won't emit any EMFs if it's just a good old school wired phone that can still work.
Yeah, you point out to the kids, they have no idea. My kids are 15, I have twins. They wonder what that thing is with the wires on it that's plugged into the wall, It's amazing. Yeah. But yes, it's better. So the question I had, this is a little bit off topic, where
sure.
I get concerned because I also studied psychology, and you look at the old Pavlovian sort of operant conditioning where you ring a bell and then you make it, you give a dog a little bit of food on the tongue and they start to salivate, and then all of a sudden you've now paired the salivation to the ring and not actually giving them the food. And I really feel that that's happening now at the level where kids get texts or we get alerts and we almost sense it. Oh, I got something, we get before it even comes in. And then, when my daughter, I've mentioned this to my audience before, if someone gets in trouble in my house, then the penalty is they get their phone taken away. And I want to have restrictions in terms of not just how close it is to their body, but, how absolute amount of time they get to use it, Nicholas. But the thing is, it's almost like she goes through withdrawal. It really is. It's like she feels like she needs that. I almost joke around like she's like starts scratching, like as if they're going through withdrawal because they don't have their little fix. Have you looked at all, or is that sort of beyond sort of what you've looked at? I thought it would be a good corollary between the neurotransmitter component of it in terms of the dopamine, especially when people are susceptible, and sort of that almost the addiction, the withdrawal, or even how we relate back to, maybe it's a good segue for you to talk about how you have people that actually are a little more EMF sensitive, like you've mentioned, in some of your things that I've read was, Better Call Saul, his brother, who is, very EMF sensitive. So I'm sure a couple questions in there in terms of, number one, have you looked at that in terms of the neurotransmitter and the addictive component, which is beyond sort of the EMF? And then number two, why some people have that electrical sensitivity more than someone else?
Yeah, well, it's a charged question. I haven't looked, and this is actually one of my next missions. I've realized throughout my work, maybe it's going to be a book for in 3-4 years, but let's face it, even if we end up having better signals, let's say other kinds of EMFs with a different frequency, and we discover how to make them completely safe, it doesn't mean that the technology will be healthy for us. We're still addicted. I mean, I was digging through my book as we were talking. It's 27% of parents report being addicted to their cell phone.
Right.
And then you have it's 50% of teenagers age 14 that say I'm addicted too. So when you have parents that are addicted, obviously they preach by the example. It is a societal problem. I read several studies that I can quote because I'm not the expert in those, but I've read stuff like children that are taken away from their devices go through some withdrawal, and after 2 weeks you see reversal of ADHD, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, incredible like clinical results, and these are made by like psychologists and doctors and functional medicine oriented practitioners. And these things, if it were a pill, it would sell for millions, like right. Or trillions. I mean, so just removing technology, it seems that there's a perfect storm of a lot of things, the way I see it. The technology was conceived in the perfect way to make us addicted to the devices. And it's not like this is some evil plan. It's just that the engineers that did it are great. They are great minds, and they develop something that is fun to look at, that is intuitive. You want to connect with it. You have sounds, you have beeps, you have vibration. Everything about it is awesome, and you can connect with people. And even social media, the way it's built, is there's always something. There's always something. I have a really hard time getting out of it myself. I'm in front of my computer, and maybe we just started selling my book a couple of weeks ago, and then it's like, bing! Oh, we made a sale. I'm so happy. There's a reward when you look, you refresh pages, you go through social media. So the way everything has been built, even the engineers now that have built the iPhone and the first apps, and the inventors that are now billionaires, they say a lot of them show regrets because they say that I didn't think people would be so addicted to their phones, and I wish people were a bit more moderate with the technology that we built. So even people from the Silicon Valley side of things are kind of regretting what they did to some extent. At the same time, they had no intention to make people this addicted, but it's a good business model, that being said. Of course, then you have the blue light, right? So a device that emits a lot of light that is super bright, and I put something, a software program called Iris, IRIS, that is a software to make my screen look a little bit more orange. Another one is called Flux. And these software can make the eye strain a little bit less, but even it's not just a question of eye strain, it's a question of like blue light is so stimulating, and it will reduce your melatonin at night, and it will, I think it will also kind of screw up your dopamine, because it tricks your body into thinking it's bright day. So it plays a lot with your neurotransmitter. I know that for a fact, and there's so many studies about the effects of blue light, even on macular degeneration. So it screws up your eyes, and that plays with your mind a little bit. So everything combined makes it so that we're addicted. It's something new, and you just have to look around. People are, I'm waiting at the subway train and I'm listening to a podcast, but I'm not down on my phone. I see everyone is down on their phone because we cannot literally spend a minute just waiting now. We're like, goldfish, and I include myself in that. I have a very hard time staying out of it as an entrepreneur, as an author, doing podcasts. I'll be on my computer and I'll be tempted to look at email several times a day, even if that's not a good habit. And I think there's a dopamine hit every time a new thing comes into the mailbox, because, oh, what if it's a new opportunity? What if it's cool news? What if it's something interesting? And it turns out it's an ad, and you're like, oh, okay, you just delete it, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute, what was I working on? Oh, sorry, Joel, I just lost my thought because someone is pinging me about something completely useless. Yeah. So that's what's happening in our life. So I think everything is contributing to remove part of our humanity, and I think that children are a little bit more at risk. And I'm trying to find the name of the researcher who has published an incredible, I think it's called Reset Your Children's Brain. I would think so. Hold on. Victoria Dunkley. She's a researcher, an MD. This book I haven't read yet, but I heard her on several interviews and podcasts, and she goes into why are children kind of so anxious in a society? So ADHD, there's also autism. So it gets very controversial very fast because everyone's looking for a culprit. I think it's probably a perfect storm, just like when it comes to adrenal fatigue. But she did a great book about that, and she has a 4-week plan to kind of get your child back on a normal behavior. And part of it, she talks about EMFs quite a lot. I think it's that plus other things plus diet. But I think it plays with our minds a lot. And if you want to know about the mechanism, well, one of them is the opening of the blood-brain barrier. So around your brain, you have this barrier called the blood-brain barrier that is just permeable enough to let nutrients in, but to try to block toxins or viruses or invaders. And Alan Frey, he was a researcher back in the 70s. He showed that just a couple minutes of cell phone exposure actually made this barrier more leaky, more susceptible to having bad stuff come in, and more susceptible to having these neurotransmitters leak out of your brain where they should be. So I think that the more time you spend on a cell phone, you probably have some leakage where you lose these neurotransmitters, or there's just havoc and confusion in there, so it doesn't compute as well, and you lose, like, you're more prone to anxiety. And this totally correlates with what is shown when people use their cell phone more, and they're more at risk for anxiety and depression and other neurological symptoms. So I think it all makes sense. And if people still argue that a cell phone cannot open up or EMFs cannot open up the blood-brain barrier, well, consider that there's an entire new science that is called, or technique called electrochemotherapy, where they will use EMFs that are similar to a cell phone, only stronger, to open up the blood-brain barrier to make chemotherapy go into the brain, because normally chemotherapy is very ineffective when it comes to treating brain cancer and brain tumors. So it exists, it's used, and it's known. It's just that a cell phone is way lower in power density, but we can argue that it probably uses the same mechanism. And if you talk on your cell phone all day, every day, you're not having this couple minutes treatment in electrochemotherapy, but you're essentially maybe doing the same. Who knows? Like, no one has studied that, but it's kind of putting 2 and 2 together here.
It's like having your cake and eating it too. On the one hand, you're saying, no, it's not impacting you. On the other hand. And, it's same thing with a lot of things like mercury. Mercury in the teeth is okay, but mercury, if you transport it, you have to have, like, basically, it's just crazy. So it is crazy. And it is the perfect storm. And, as far as, I don't want to get too much into mechanics, but that the way it hits the blue light impacts hippocampus. Hippocampus regulates, with the amygdala. There's a good book by, I'm listening to it now, actually, and let me just see what the name of that book is. Actually, I'm not going to be able to find it because I have this iPhone 10 now, and I actually don't know how to swipe everything yet. So, but it's a book about just the way that we overwhelm our dopamine and our serotonin, and with exposures to blue light and the hippocampus and the HPA axis, and that's really getting into what I do. But anyways, Nicholas, I want to thank you so much for being here today. I really great tips. I think it's a really commendable thing that you're using this as a mission to shout from the rooftops, hey, we need to be aware of this, because ultimately this is impacting us, and to what extent we're not sure, but to put our head in the sand and not think it is, that is really naive. And why, when I get down to helping people from the adrenal or the mitochondrial level, it comes down to basics. What can we remove first? What can we do in terms of removing our exposure? I actually patented a term. It's called reducing your stress footprint. And it's kind of like the same thing as reducing your ecological footprint. Reduce the amount of information that's coming into you so your body doesn't have to process it. And, go figure, going out and walking on the grass and going in, the sun and going and being one with nature is something that's is sort of a few and far between now. And research with polyphenols and research with oxygen and research with earthing and all the things that you get back to nature is really what it's all about. The book is called, I love the name of the book, The Non-Tinfoil Guide to EMFs, How to Fix Our Stupid Use of Technology. I think it's, it's really playful, but yet you had to take that approach with such a controversial subject, especially when there are politics involved and there are, lobbyists, as you've mentioned, where, they basically get to do whatever they want. There's no penalties or repercussions against them, and you make light of it, but at the same time you expose it and you put the mirror up in front of not just our face, but their face too. So I wanted to thank you for that. You've allowed me to try to have people get in touch with your book because it's just at the very beginning of getting released. I do have my Adrenal Fatigue Society page, and we're going to create /EMF, and that's where they can get contact with the book. I'm really grateful that we're doing this. I'd love to get back with you and talk to you about some of the stuff we do, and talk about the neurotransmitters, and maybe collaborate if you go down that other rabbit hole on how else it impacts the EMFs impact the mitochondria. Do you have any other last things you'd like to say, or also how people can get in contact with you, or just any other sort of parting pieces of advice or good information you may want to say as sort of your last little parting thing?
Sure. Well, my number one thing as a parting thought is to just try to do one thing you heard about in the interview. If it's turning off the Wi-Fi at night, do it for a couple of nights and see how you feel. And if you have a tracking device, even better, because that way it's not just your mind playing tricks with you. It's important because you have to know and to feel that it's true. Don't take my word for it. Look at everything we talked about. Everything is verifiable. Really think by yourself, because in other parts of the world right now, what I'm saying is common sense. For example, I've got one example that makes people raise their eyebrows is the mayor of Krakow, that's one of the major cities in Poland, was elected because he swore to defend the population against EMF pollution in the city. And he was elected over that. That was the one that was promised, and then he's doing something about it. They're removing Wi-Fi hotspots or moving the cell phone towers outside in the countryside, inside of freaking downtown on some rooftop. So it's happening right now, whether you like it or not. The island of Cyprus, they've banned Wi-Fi in school. In France, they've banned Wi-Fi in nurseries. They're moving towards other bans. So it's happening in multiple other countries. Even India and China and Russia are more aware of the problem than we are in Canada and in the US. So it's coming, and I suggest that you take action now as a preventative measure to feel better. And if you do this test for a couple of nights and feel better, well, imagine what compounding effect can happen if you sleep better, 10% better for a whole year. Your health will be better. It's just removing another factor. It's not the sole cause of all diseases, but it is an important one to consider, and it will increase, except if you choose to say no to your Bluetooth. I don't know. You're like your Bluetooth watering plant now that you can have, where your plant will send you a text if the plant needs to be watered through a special sensor. Like, do you really need that? Ask yourself that before making new purchases and going the smart route and the Internet of Things. Everything will be wireless. So before hopping on the hype and the technology, I know these things are convenient. I know they're exciting, but do you really need your toaster to text you in the morning to say, hi, sweetie, or I don't know what?
Right.
Like, there are crazy things happening everywhere. And this is just blanketing your own home where you have control over. If you're in the city walking around, you have little control over your exposures level. So you might as well make your home as clean as possible. And yes, it will not be smart. It will not be that cool or technological, but at least you'll feel good. So prioritize your health at first at home and remove those sources, and you will feel better.
Yeah, it's an awesome distinction. I always, my adage is that, a lot of people are doing a lot of things right. But if they're doing the 1 or 2 or 3% difference that they're not doing properly, water is still not going to boil at 98 or 97 or 98.
Yeah.
It needs to boil at, so all those things need to be put in place, especially for the population that watches this, that is overwhelmed, that has so much information coming in at one time, and then they don't even know about the invisible stuff and don't assume that it's there. So I really, again, want to thank you so much for giving me your time today, Nicholas. It's a privilege for me to interview you. I think it's going to be an awesome book. It's something that, like you've mentioned, it's very, very necessary. You have in the book also these countries that are on board. You sort of the saving grace for humanity, as you've mentioned.
Yeah.
And also, you know, what I think always is there's awesome opportunity too, where just this thing is so bad in it's just so obnoxiously beyond our, you know, utility, and it's just too, you know, overwhelmingly to our health. But there's all this other opportunity too, where you can get a lot of great things out of it. The last thing I was going to say is I can't remember with the Altiger report. I remember he recommended a comedian, and it made me laugh because he talked about Gary something or other was the comedian, and he talked about it's a good thing now that the phone component of our phone is actually like an app. It's like, how dare someone actually calls me on my phone, you know, like I use it as like, you know, as texting, as apps, as whatever, but it's kind of a good thing now. Like he joked around where it's like someone's calling me like at 9:30 at night, like how dare they call me on my phone? Like it's, you know, it's just like, what the heck? It's like, it's almost the phone component itself is almost like an app in a lot of ways, which is kind of good because of all the things that you've mentioned, but I just kind of laughed at that comment and that joke. But anyways, I wanted to thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to maybe interviewing you again somewhere down the road, and I wish you future success in all your endeavors and with the new book and everything else that you do. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks very much, Joel. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.